So I'm a researcher at the RAND Corporation, but I came to that via a 30-year journey through the Army and a desire all along the way to have some sort of an academic experience and to write and to research too. The 30 years in the Army was really how I came to be where I am today, and that came from growing up in the late 60s and early 70s, just the influences on my life. The Vietnam War on TV, the Six-Day War is sort of the first major political event that I remember, and then seminally the Yom Kippur War in 1973, which left me with this impression that I didn't like sitting watching events happen on TV. I felt more that I wanted to be an agent in them. And having already been interested in history and specifically military history, I decided that when I grew up I was going to join the Army. Maybe for a short period of time, maybe for a career, maybe get out of the Army and go into the Foreign Service, but be impactful in that arena. And that's what I did. When I finished college, I enlisted in the Army and started a journey that, like I said, lasted 30 years in the Army. Along the way, I continued to sort of think about national security, foreign policy, picked up a few degrees, and when I was ready to retire from the Army and wanted to continue working in that field, being able to do the kind of research that I do now was appealing, and so that's how I chose to transition from the Army into my second career. That's how I came to be.
Can you say just a little bit about what you do now?
So RAND is a large research corporation. It has several different divisions, some of which are what are called federally funded research and development corporations, funded by Congress and supporting the Army, the Air Force, and the Department of Defense. And those institutions have research questions, and we have researchers who can answer questions, and so I get involved in being a member of or forming a research team that can help provide answers to those kinds of organizations. RAND, of course, does more than just those three. They also have RAND Health, RAND Education, so potentially I could work in other areas of RAND and do research that was relevant to answering the same kinds of questions that any other research corporation would be asked to answer by a foundation, by a government, or in this case by our federal government.
So do I understand right that the government is one contractor with RAND among many?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's not an arm of the federal government, but it ends up being a regular contributor to policy.
It does. So, and I'm probably not the best person to explain RAND and its business model, but there are aspects of RAND. There are three of these FFRDCs, federally funded research and development corporations, and what that means is that the Army, the Air Force, and the Secretary of Defense all have funding lines from Congress which are dedicated to using RAND to answer their questions. And those contracts can change over time. There's the Navy, their FFRDC is called CNAS, the Center for Naval Analysis and Studies, I think it is, and there's another one, the Institute for Defense Analysis. So they have the same kinds of funding streams. I think there are actually non-defense FFRDCs, but that's not sort of my area, so I don't really know. But yeah, so that's Congress has already said, government organization, here's money for you to use at this FFRDC under this contract for the next several years to answer your research questions. But again, RAND has a wide variety of research that is funded through other sources than the federal government too.
Now, is the legislation that establishes these links to pieces of RAND, is this specifically requesting that RAND do the research?
So again, not really my area of expertise. As I understand it, the FFRDC contracts are like any other government contract. They're term limited and renewable, and when your term's up, you have to compete. against potentially other bidders for that contract. So again, the not the lawyer, I'm not the congressman. My guess is something to the effect that the congressional language authorizes the expenditure of this funds to whoever holds the contract for that FFRDC without naming them necessarily by name. And then the contracting vehicle is what designates that RAND will be supporting, RAND Arroyo, for example, will be supporting the Army this year.
I see. And so the way something gets entrenched is that it just keeps winning that bidding process over and over and over again.
Right. Or it fails to win the bidding process, and the ownership of the FFRDC or the responsibility, the linkage to the FFRDC funding shifts to a new organization. I can't cite examples. It's not something I've bothered to research.
No need. I'm just trying to get a sense of how far the distance is between the government and RAND. That's kind of interesting stuff. Now, how much? I mean, I would expect that the questions you get to think about are some mixture of questions you can talk about and questions you can't talk about. Is that basically right?
Yes. That's a fair statement. and not talking about them is not just a question of classification, it's also a question of client privilege.
Yeah.
So there's both aspects to it.
So there are some things that you do or that your group does that are pretty public.
So at the end of each research project, and I've only been at RAND for 16 months, so I'm still learning a lot about the process. But when I was still in the Army, I employed RAND to do research for me. So as an example, the last project that I was sort of the sponsoring officer from within the Army, asking RAND through this FFRDC contract with RAND Arroyo to provide some research answers for us. The last thing that I was asked when the project was completed was, did I want to restrict access to the research, or was I willing to make the research open to the public? And inside the Army, there's a decision-making process that goes through. The Army took its own sweet time, but eventually decided that they would make it available to the public. And if you go to RAND's website now, you could actually sort of, search for Chris Pernin and his study on readiness, and you could find the publicly available results of the research that Chris did on my behalf when I was Colonel Linick on some questions we had about measuring readiness and something that the Army calls MTOs, or Modified Tables of Organization and Equipment. But there are other studies where, for whatever reason, the sponsor has chosen not to make the research public, and so RAND has that research available internally, but it's restricted based on the level of dissemination the sponsor will allow us to do.
I see. Was it a big switch from ordering RAND studies to doing them?
It was kind of interesting, and people have asked me about that a lot. What was the transition like? Two of my last 3 jobs in the Army involved doing research or supervising the execution of research. Maybe not the same kind of academic research that RAND would do, but research nevertheless. Developing of models, understanding history and interpreting it, and other kinds of things. Sometimes we would employ a place like RAND to help us with that research. Sometimes we would employ internal analytic agencies. There's the Army's Center for Army Analysis. There's the Army's TRADOC Analysis Center. And so I had experience in developing concepts for research and in leading it either directly with my own team of people or from a distance by managing the research of other teams. When I was doing that, I had a staff of about 30 people. I operated on an Army budget-driven cycle, which is an annual cycle in terms of how fast we had to develop products and things like that. Probably spent half my day doing personnel administration and management and other kinds of management tasks. And of course, I had a lot of responsibilities for sort of conveying the results, the emerging results of that research or that analysis up through the Army leadership. When I transitioned to RAND, I was just a plain sort of researcher. I mean, I do still lead research teams, and so on the research projects I work on, it could be a mix where I'm a member on somebody else's team and they're leading the research project and I'm contributing, or I could be the leader myself where I build a research team, develop a research protocol, go out and execute it, supervise the writing, and work with my RAND colleagues to produce the product. What I don't do really is management and administration. I don't have the same recurring level of requirements to brief Army senior leadership. It's much more sporadic. The timeline tends to be driven by a research timeline, which might be months to a year, instead of a budget cycle timeline, which might be days to weeks to maybe a month or two. And so there's a little bit more time for contemplation. The other real biggest difference, and one that is just a joy to me, is I love my soldiers, I love my civilians, but all of us were culturally somewhat homogenous. We all had grown up in the Army bureaucracy, we had all been taught in the same Army schools, we tended to bring the same general cultural perspective. There were variations and whatever. At RAND, I can bring in economists and physicists and computer scientists and mathematicians who know how to spell Army and not much more, and bring them these problems for the Army or for the Department of Defense, and they can come at it in unique ways that my research teams back in the Army wouldn't have thought of, with sort of modern research methodologies and without the embedded biases of 15 or 20 years or more inside the Army culture. And so I think we get some really unique ways to think through problems and can present results back to the Army or to OSD that they wouldn't be able to generate internally.
I remember part of what got me into this business was watching a show with what you might regard as an extremely radical critic of American foreign policy, military policy. And the surprising thing he said was, I go to all the intelligence conferences. Mm-hmm. The intelligence guys, you can talk to them. They value intelligence. Sure. You know, they actually understand arguments. Right. You know, I thought that was a striking statement from someone who was as opposed right. to the directions of policy as I think it was probably possible for a person to be.
I think that most people would probably be surprised at the internal level of discourse that occurs within the services about policy. I think there's probably a perception of us having been sort of a lockstep monolithic group of yes men who didn't question. And I will tell you that the vibrancy of academic discussion and of curiosity and of the search for alternatives inside the military is very high. I think that the American people probably don't understand just how educated not only their officer corps is, but their NCO corps. The TV shows that show, or the movies that show, you know, sort of the combat experience neglect sometimes to capture the deliberative processes that go on. And I'm not going to say that they're perfect. They're not. We're humans. We have our own sort of focus and whatever. But there are robust debates about not just what should foreign policy be, but then how should, regardless of the foreign policy, how should the department best support that foreign policy in terms of how it organizes, mans, trains, and equips the nation's military. And you do get the clash of cultures in that sense between the Air Force, the Navy, the Marines, and the Army about looking at the same problem set and coming up with varying solutions. So there's a very healthy competition of ideas that goes on. I'm not so sure that the general public's always aware of it. The militarily interested general public probably is, because a lot of it gets written in the professional journals and sometimes leaks out into the New York Times and the Washington Post and stuff. But I would accept the criticism that probably is much more towards sort of the center and right of the spectrum of American foreign policy thought than it is off to the left. But that's, I think, there's a selection bias there. The people who are doing this as a profession have already selected to be in that part that is more focused on the application of force than other elements of national power.
Well, I've made it a kind of hobby to look at portrayals of intelligence in media, not that I've done anything comprehensive. I think military thinking actually comes off pretty well. The West Wing did a tremendous kind of PR job for the Situation Room.
Sure.
And of course there were dunderheads in the Situation Room, but it was a place where arguments were heard and people's minds were changed. I think Tom Clancy did a pretty good job.
I think so too. The military has this thing they call the military decision-making process, and I don't know if that's just an Army term or if that extends to the other services, but I'd be surprised if their analytic processes are different. But it is a structured way of thinking through a problem set that we teach from the time you're commissioned or go to your first non-commissioned officer course all the way through the rest of your career, that starts with this very detailed thing called mission analysis, where you're really looking at, okay, what are the facts, what are the assumptions, and you spend time searching both for the obvious assumptions and for the hidden assumptions, and reviewing guidance. And there's feedback loops where you go back and reconfirm, each time you think you've made progress, you go back to your leadership and you say, this is where we think we are, this is where we think we're going. And unfortunately, sometimes that gets condensed into a very short period of time because you don't have a lot of time. But the training is such that you are taught to not take anything for granted, to develop multiple courses of action, to develop criteria for measuring the courses of action, and to develop ways to compare across, to look for alternatives. Sometimes we do it in the spirit in which it's meant to be. Sometimes we offer it a little bit more just lip service. Yeah, I had 3 COAs, but everybody knows it's going to be this course of action that we're going to do. But at least the training is there, that to be successful, you have to have demonstrated this critical thinking ability to decompose a problem to its most basic parts, and then to try to find 2 or 3 or 4 solutions that are plausible, feasible, suitable, acceptable, and see what kinds of variants and outcomes you get from those different courses of action, and then select the best based on commander's judgment of how he sees this playing out over time.
I'm imagining a couple of levels of frustration in the kind of work you've done previously and now. But on the one hand, right now your problem, as I can imagine it, is you don't get to ask the questions, you just get to answer them. Is that fair? I mean, that somebody sends you a project saying, this is what we need to know. You have 30 years of experience telling people what was needed, and some ideas about what question actually might be the right question. How does that play out?
So there is a certain frustration in that sense, in that the easiest source for me of research material, the easiest to access, is to go to the Army or go to OSD and say, what are the issues I can help you solve? And have them frame the question for me. I get to be an active participant then in sort of problem definition at that point. How are we going to... But at the end of the day, it was really their question, their issue. For senior guys like me who came from the Army, one of the luxuries we have is the network that we established before we left the Army. So sometimes we can go and say to somebody, here's a question I think you should be asking us to answer for you. And they can either choose to take that bait or not. Inside of RAND, again, because our funding sources aren't purely FFRDCs, I think one of the cool things are, if there's something I really want to do and I'm not able to do it through the FFRDC contracts by going to the Pentagon and asking the Pentagon to ask me to answer this, or if I don't think they're asking the right questions, I'm free to write the same kind of a grant that any academic would and submit the grant request to any grant offering organization. Now there's not a lot that are going to offer grants for the kind of national security stuff that I might want to write about, but I suppose I could research them and find them. And then there are opportunities in RAND to compete for internal research funding. So if I do have a question that I think either I'm not likely to get funded by the Department of Defense, or that I absolutely want to make sure that everybody understands it's an independent assessment and not influenced by the Department of Defense, I can make an argument inside of RAND for some funding, and I can go do that kind of research inside of RAND and hopefully get it published. And so there are some options for that, for those things I have this burning desire to do.
Yeah. So is it imaginable, for example, that somebody who was looking at the rationale for the war, for our first war in Iraq, or rather for the Junior Bush's war in Iraq, and said, "Look, this nuclear stuff looks fishy." There are all sorts of things that suggest that the stuff, this intelligence coming out of Africa is crazy. Mm-hmm. Would there have been any future in somebody going to the RAND or, as it were, board of directors and saying, "I want to do an independent assessment of the intelligence on Iraq's nuclear capability"? So
that very well could have been the kind of research question somebody would have posed, the way you put it at the end. I'd like to do an independent assessment of the intelligence that was available to the Bush administration at the time that they were making the decision to invade Iraq. Who would ask us and fund us to do that question? I don't know. Would RAND be willing to take it on? I'm not willing to speak for the corporation about that, but I think they might find it an interesting research project to take on.
But in the past tense, as an historical question, of course the interesting thing from the standpoint of the independence of RAND is, could they have taken it on when the intelligence was being generated, when the news pieces were hitting the New York Times saying we have reason to believe that these kinds of materials are being purchased, etc.
So, I guess what I'd offer is that if that was the kind of thing somebody was thinking of doing, they would run into the same challenges that any researcher runs into, which is access to data. So, as an independent researcher questioning current operations inside the government, you have to wonder what access to data would you have independently, that wasn't provided to you directly by the government, with whatever set of biases you want to assume are included in the data they present you. What are your independent sources of data that you can actually and legally access to answer that question? And for every researcher, I think that's kind of the biggest issue, is where am I going to find data for this? So I don't know what would have been available that would have allowed any researcher to say, this is truly a comprehensive independent assessment based on the data available.
Well, just to press it a little bit, there's the question of whether it would have made any sense for somebody to do it, whether it would have been feasible to do it.
Right.
But suppose, just hypothetically, that somebody had an argument for feasibility. There were enough things leaking out, enough things in the public domain casting doubt on this information to make it interesting, to make it worth a few months of poking around.
Right.
Is an organization like RAND independent enough of the direction of policy to say, okay, this is interesting. Let's, we'll find a little time we'll let one guy spend a couple months checking this thing out, just in case there's something to it.
I can't really speak to the question. I don't have enough time in RAND to really understand the corporate culture. Yeah. But I kind of go back again to fundamentally, somebody has to ask us the research question, or some researcher inside of RAND has to convince RAND to provide the funding for them to do it internally. And so I don't know how that process in RAND works. It's not my level of responsibility inside the organization to know that. But I do believe that RAND has produced controversial work in the sense of independent work that the government or others would say is not necessarily hewing to the party line, but well-researched, well-founded, strongly argued, and impactful. But that's, the hypothetical you're posing is something I'm just not prepared to, by my background, to be able to answer.
That's fair. That's fair. I just, it's always a question, just where the sources of high IQ dissent might come. I mean, there are plenty of people with signs wearing costumes, but the dissent that will be serious is dissent from research sources, alternative voices from research sources. And one of my big questions as a citizen and as somebody who's very fond of the academy is, where are the best possibilities for the alternative view that turns out to be right to come from? And that's kind of what's behind this.
So, RAND is far from the only research organization in the defense arena. There are certainly several others that are each speaks to sort of a different audience with a different purpose. And so the question is, does the universe of different voices constitute a wide enough net that everything that needs to be heard can be heard? Yeah. And everybody's going to have their own opinion about that, but we're not alone in what we do.
Yeah. Do you feel pretty optimistic about that?
About the public debate, the publicly available research debate?
About the public debate not missing important points, important arguments, important directions.
In general, I do. I think in general there's a fairly robust debate where I sometimes tend towards a little cynicism is in the question of whether the people we want to hear are listening, and whether they will prioritize what we have to hear over other preferences that they might have for priorities. So we may be compelling in the microcosm in which we speak, and yet not compelling enough to cause them to reorient priorities because this isn't where their focus is.
Well, that leads me to kind of another frustration question.
Sure.
Because before RAND, you were 30 years in the military, and a certain piece of that you were in places where you're making decisions and ordering studies and so forth. And so you have this odd situation there where you've got to you deal with ideas, you deal with situations every day. You have a sense of what we need to know, where we need to go. But it must have happened. We don't have to name times, but it must have happened from time to time that you know that the place we need to go, nobody up the ranks is going to want to go, can go, politically can get it through. This
Right.
one doesn't fly.
Right.
I mean, that does happen a bunch, right?
So, again, I'll go back to that military decision-making process I talked about. The courses of action that you develop have to be suitable, feasible, and acceptable. And so there are times when what is suitable, feasible, and from the objective criteria, the best option are not acceptable for whatever reason because of other things that intrude, and yeah, senior leader preferences play a role. Politics plays a role. I did force structure stuff, and you could make compelling cases. You could build business cases that said, "Here's something we need to do," and then you would realize that what you needed to do was in a particular politician's district, and that politician was unlikely to be amenable to what you wanted to do, and so you included that as one of your decision criteria. How important was that political fight compared to the, how do you monitorize political relationships? How do you calculate that in your cost-benefit analysis? Luckily for me, that wasn't my job. My job was to lay out the facts, and then the senior leaders had to weigh out the politics, and then I would make my best argument, and they would give me their decision, and that's what we would go and do. I don't imagine that in the corporate world it's really any different, or for that matter in the academic world. There are certain things that the chancellor wants, and it doesn't really matter that the subjective cost-benefit facts lead you in a different direction. The chancellor is going to go where the chancellor wants to go for some other political calculation.
Yeah, and I see it all over the place.
So.
But then the thing that I was curious about is is there a division of labor in the screening of this thing where acceptable happens a pay grade up, and you figure out what makes sense at your level, and then kick it up to the next level to screen, to winnow that down to what anybody's going to be willing to buy? Or does acceptable begin to kind of work its way through the feasibility calculations too, or say, I'm not going to propose this because I know that Rumsfeld is never going to buy it or anything within 3,000 miles of it, and my career is going to look like yesterday's newspaper if I suggest it.
So I can't answer for everybody who's been in my shoes.
Yeah.
I can tell you the approach I took.
Yeah, good.
And again, so going back to this military decision-making process, one of the things I said before is that at every step along the way, if the process is working right, you're going back to the ultimate decision maker, and you're sort of verifying where you've gone and where you're going and getting additional guidance. So if you start moving into this area where, what's suitable and feasible might not be acceptable, that should occur in one of these in-progress back brief things, and you can have that discussion, and I have, and then you can have it multiple times. You can continue to come back and say, the research still indicates this is where we should go. I know you've given us guidance, but I want you to understand the costs of that guidance. Because ultimately you, the decision maker, the senior leader, have to do your own personal cost-benefit analysis. We call it the commander's estimate. And whether that commander is the Secretary of the Army or the company commander getting ready to go into combat, it's still, the commander's estimate. So my approach was always to remind them along the way of the opportunity cost, if you will, the risk, the issues around using quote-unquote acceptable as a decision criteria, and make sure that at each step they had the opportunity to continue to weigh that cost in their decision. I never but once got thrown out of anybody's office, and I still went back to his office again when he calmed down and we could have that rational discussion. So, again, the job for me as the staff officer was to make sure the commander had the right information to help him shape it, organize it, in a way that he or she could make a decision. And I didn't feel I was doing my job if I didn't refuse to allow them to foreclose opportunities just because of acceptability kinds of issues. And at some point when you've exhausted that line of effort. But I think it's pretty far down the road for most of the leaders I worked with.
So, I mean, it seems like here is a field for courage. I mean, you're causing people, very powerful people who have a certain amount of control over your career, a fairly subtle and complex kind of pain. I mean, it's like I come in today and say the thing that anything in the direction that you've suggested as acceptable is pretty stupid. You say, okay, do it. Nevertheless, we've got to do it. And the next day you come back and say, very stupid, extraordinarily stupid.
Well, so I would submit that the alternative to the best is not always stupid. It's the next best. Okay. Or something that's still suitable and feasible. It's just not as good. So, if you say to somebody, you can earn $100, and if you don't, you're going to be destitute for the rest of your life. That's sort of a different argument than if you say you can earn $100 by doing this, but you could earn $90 by doing this, and letting them make the decision about which of the two tasks they'd rather do based on the $10 difference in the return to them. So I don't think we ever developed sets of courses of action where one was the only right way to go and everything else was stupid. We developed options that had differing costs, differing benefits, and you had to make a political or a personal choice about which basket of goods, of costs and benefits were palatable to you, or which were likely to go best in the direction you went.
Yeah, I'm just imagining somebody, in the upper levels of decision making, sleeps pretty well because he thinks or she thinks, well, I couldn't get the best thing through. That was a non-starter. But I got something pretty good through. Right. Something I can live with.
Well, I would like to think our Congress would start thinking that way.
But then your job as the staff person is to disturb that sleep by pointing out all of the problems with the second best or the third best or the 15th best or whatever.
Well, I would say that my job is to make sure that the decision to accept second best instead of best is a well-considered decision and not an ill-considered decision.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So to understand that the difference between the two job offers is $10, when mentally you might have decided it was $100.
Yes, good. That's very helpful. Now, I mean, Plato is in the Laches has a wonderful discussion of courage. Mm-hmm. And he's got a couple of old generals who think, well, courage is standing your ground and fighting. And he first of all points out that Athens always wins by running away. That's the first thing he points out. Right. But the second thing he points out, or at least it comes fairly soon, is that courage also shows up in a lot of other contexts, including engagements with your fellow soldiers and with your superiors, and ultimately both of the generals he's talking to lose the war because they lack the courage to stand up to either their fellow officers or to the Athenian assembly.
Well, so what you're describing is kind of the discussion that H.R. McMaster starts in his book, Dereliction of Duty. H.R. McMaster, by the way, is a lieutenant general in the Army now that I know and respect. But his PhD thesis was Dereliction of Duty, which sort of argued that the generals at the time of the Vietnam War were derelict in their duty for not having these kinds of frank discussions with the politicians at the time. And then you have sort of a countervailing set of arguments that have arisen in response to that, and in response to the kind of dialogues people would like to imagine did or didn't happen with regards to the recent set of wars about this issue of, how do you best exercise this dialogue between the military and the politicians about what is and isn't feasible in the use of force. And it's a very difficult discussion, and I think that that there is a tremendous amount of courage and skepticism and argument expressed by our senior leaders, senior uniformed leaders, to our senior civilian leadership. But again, in the spirit of kind of the process I've been talking about, I think once they've done their best to make sure that the leader truly understands and hasn't discounted the costs and the benefits, our entire constitutional process is premised on us in uniform listening to what those who are elected by the United States citizens tell us to do, and to do it. And that's the greatest strength of the United States military, is that we have leaders who are courageous enough, I believe, to engage in a meaningful dialogue with those political leaders, whether it happens publicly or whether it happens privately. I think that I don't know it for a fact, but I think we underappreciate how much these discussions do happen in private, as opposed to in congressional testimony or in public or something like that. But I think that we feel the duty at that point to not necessarily resign and say, I can't agree with what you said. I think that what we have to do is make sure that we've made that last valiant effort to make sure they understand what we're saying, and then abide by their decision and execute it as best we can. I don't know what that line is. I don't know what, call it the McMaster line is. At what point do you say back to the leader, fine, go find somebody else to do it, but I'm not going to be a party to this. But it is an interesting debate that does happen in the press and in the papers and in the academic journals about when do you approach that line and where are you on it. So.
The Roman Catholics have an institution I've always admired, the devil's advocate. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you throw that around, but it's an actual role in the canonization process.
Right.
There's somebody whose job it is to dig up dirt.
Right.
He's failing as soon as he digs up something good. He throws that away.
Right.
And in the formal canonization, procedure, I think there's actually a place for the devil's advocate in the procession, looking downcast,
standing behind Caesar, reminding him he's mortal. But yeah.
But I mean, you're and I guess. I wonder, in all sorts of institutions, and I can ask you because you've been in a couple of places where decisions are made, does anybody ever institute, I mean, not just play the devil's advocate, but institute that, ask for what they call in politics, the opposition research? I mean...
So formally in the military, we have incorporated a concept that we call the red team. And so in virtually every major headquarters, there is usually a colonel. Sometimes, I suppose it could be a brigadier general, sometimes a lieutenant colonel, but there's generally a colonel who has a team of highly intelligent people. They could be strategists, they could be operations research folks who can do formal modeling, could be intelligence specialists. And yeah, their job is to independently pick apart the work of the staff and point out all of the flawed assumptions or all of the risks that haven't been mitigated, to say, you've got these biases in your analysis that you need to eliminate. So there is formal red teaming that is done at varying levels of skill and with varying levels of effectiveness in virtually every major headquarters that we have now. I knew some of the red team guys in Iraq, and they were really good at what they did. And they included civilian experts, academics that we would bring in, culture experts that we would bring in, and stuff like that. So that's a form of the devil's advocate, in the sense that you're using it. Inside the department, the institution, the Army headquarters, the Department of Defense headquarters, I'm not so sure how much red teaming goes on, but each of the services and the Department of Defense have an organization called, and it varies from each to each. In the Army, it's Program Analysis and Evaluation. In the Department of Defense, it's Concepts Analysis and Program Evaluation. And although they get intimately involved in actually developing the program, which is government speak for the long-term budget, they are also sort of charged to do that independent analytic assessment of, does this investment provide the return on investment that the person offering it into the budget claims it will? And are there alternative investments available that provide a better return? And in this case, investment is not, the Goldman Sachs kind of investment. It's buying the F-15 versus buying more long-range missiles. It's funding the Army at $490,000 instead of at $450,000, and using the money saved from the reduction of $40,000 to either pay down, sequester, or to invest in Joint Strike Fighter or something like that. So those kinds of outside analysis, where it's not the people developing the budget and the program who are doing the analysis, it's now sort of an independent organization within the department that is fact-checking them, if you will, and doing alternatives exploration independently. That also exists, and that's a critical part of how the budget is ultimately developed and how the program is developed. You can legitimately ask how effective it is, how comprehensive it is, how meaningful it is, and I'd submit that you'll find the entire waterfront, from really good work on really major issues to hand waves to everything in between, just sort of depending on the project, the analyst, the budget, and the time available.
I'm thinking about what an analyst might do on military stuff. Might have done, say, in the 1880s.
Uh-huh.
The big thing was trains.
Right.
Trains were moving troops, they were moving material, they Barbara Tuchman, the Guns of August, all the strategic thinking was set up around rail lines and how fast we can move troops by rail. Explosions could be made at a certain level. Accuracy of fire was at a certain level. The relationship between the science and the military would put engineering really big, but physicists, well, once you can figure out how a cannonball flies, you're kind of done,
Right.
So yeah, some of the 1880s, 1890s, looking ahead, figuring out military strategy, and then, 1905 or something, the Wright brothers get 120 yards in Kitty Hawk. Then we're suddenly, nobody could guess how fast that would go. Right now, I hear these stories, and again, it comes in a kind of weird way, little bits and pieces that, the next war will be fought from rather comfortable offices in Leningrad on the one side, Dubai on the other, and probably Montclair, New Jersey, where people will essentially play video games with each other. It's sort of Ender's Game will come true next time around. And I guess the question I want to ask is sort of, how does it feel to you thinking through these questions and saying, well, we got to worry about our assumptions, realizing that a few times in history now, the game has simply changed almost unimaginably in a period of about 10 years, and the question has to hit you: am I in one of those 10-year periods when the game is changing such that anybody's guess is pretty much bad?
So, the real challenge today is that level of uncertainty. Nobody knows what conflicts will arise or what necessarily the characteristics of them will be. The military has this concept of what they call sort of the spectrum of conflict. You'll hear people talk about hybrid warfare. But the reality is that there are different conflict regions out there, or potential conflict regions out there, each of which could exhibit different kinds of conflict. So you could have the traditional kind of infantry, artillery, tank battles occurring in one conflict zone, potentially. You could have the kinds of insurgency and civil war stuff that we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan happening in all kinds of places, and overlaid on that would be sophisticated cyber conflict. You could have this new sort of way of I know there's a term that's been emerging for it. I'm not sure what the term is, but the way Putin has exercised power, first in Georgia, now in the Ukraine, that's a different level of conflict that requires different kinds of tools to deal with. And the question remains whether traditional forms of deterrence would work, or what other forms of deterrence or response are necessary. So you have this whole spectrum, each of which has plausible likelihoods, or possibilities at least, of occurrence in different regions. And potentially each could occur in a different region nearly simultaneously. So how do you organize, man, train, and equip a military that's prepared to respond appropriately regardless of what part of that spectrum of conflict or of conflict types crops up? And that's the real challenge. It's as the Department of Defense has gone through the budget cutting debates and tried to accommodate the costs of first the Budget Control Act and then sequestration, and I know the House just passed a bill yesterday, but continuing reductions in the funding of the department, the question is which platforms and which skill sets and which capabilities do you divest, which ones do you continue to invest in, and what's the right mix based on how you see these threats. And it's a fascinating debate to watch. I think the Army's perspective is captured in this concept they have, which is called the human dimension, which basically says at the end of the day that although there are certain things you can do from a distance with drones, or from the air with missiles, or from the sea with all the things that sea power gives you, at the end of the day, conflict resolution involves humans and being on the ground and in and amongst the people. And we need an army that can operate within the human dimension and understand and not just apply force, because the Army has gone beyond just applying force, but apply leverage, kinetic force, lethal force, but apply different kinds of levers to societies, whether we do it directly, whether we do it indirectly by working with or through partners or whatever. But it is this intense period of uncertainty, and I don't think anybody really knows how it's going to resolve, or how well or poorly we've guessed. So I think that the issue is that unlike maybe before World War I, where everybody was buying hammers because they knew the next war involved nails, and so it was just a question of trying to create the best possible hammer. Today, we're trying to figure out what's the right mix of tools that we can afford because we don't know what kind of tool we're going to need for the next job that we have to do. And we need to be prepared to hammer things, to screw things, to glue things, to saw things, and I don't know, to clamp things.
Well, I can imagine you going to bed one night thinking, I've got the hardest job in the world, waking up the next morning and say, I've got the easiest job in the world because it's gotten so hard that nothing I say is any more crazy than anything else I say.
Yeah. I have a Dilbert cartoon on the door of my office, and I've actually noticed it on several other people who do the kinds of stuff that I have done and that I do. And basically, it says that the great thing about being a strategist is that by the time that you can prove that you're wrong, you're not there anymore. If you're thinking far enough about the future, you can make these compelling arguments with the best data available, but by the time that future unfolds, you're probably retired or dead, so I don't know if people find comfort in that or if they just, find madness in that of how can I stand up and say, do this when there's that level of uncertainty. But I think it's a fascinating job. It's, and I am often unpleasantly amazed at the people who can declare with certainty that they know what's going to happen, and that because they know this is what's going to happen, this is what we have to do. What we try to do as best we can is to say, here's the range of things that we think are likely or plausible to happen. You can always get the black swan. Was that Talib? Was that his name? Who wrote the Black Swan? But we can't tell you which of these things is going to happen. We can just tell you these are kind of likely to happen. So here are strategies that optimize against one and hedge against the other, that fail to optimize and hedge against, there's different ways to think about risk. And that's probably something Goldman Sachs can help you with, as well as we can, because that's what this is. This is what, if you have uncertainty, how do you find ways to quantify it and change uncertainty into risk calculations of likelihood and consequence, and then help make decisions based on that calculation?
Remember, the book that knocked me off my chair was a thing called a random walk down Wall Street.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, its point was, the first half, it takes it all back in a second, but
right.
The first half is, given that everybody's kind of accommodating whatever movie you make, and which is also the military context,
Right.
the first reader of anything you come up with is your enemy.
Right.
Will probably read it before your boss does if somebody like Snowden gets it out there to him. He just did the numbers and said, you'd be better off throwing darts. You'd be better off betting on all options.
Right.
And that's, the question, if that's right for the stock market, you mentioned Goldman Sachs.
Right.
How broadly does the same principle extend?
Well, so that comes back to preferences, and you can't really overestimate the importance of preferences and biases. So I hate to drag her into this, but I will. My wife and I have very different risk tolerances, and so there are things for which I am willing to accept a much higher level of risk than she is, and therefore I would look at a situation and say, oh, I'm certainly willing to do that, and she would choose not to. It exhibits in how we would preferentially invest it, and it exhibits in how we raise the kids, and we work through the compromise about me expanding her zone zone of risk, and her contracting mine. But there's actually theories about that. Excuse me, and I'm not an expert on them. I remember them from some early statistics and probability classes, but you can choose to maximize the possible return and sort of ignore the level, or you can choose to minimize the highest level of risk and accept a much lower likelihood of a high return. And so you have to make those kinds of decisions, whether you're investing in the stock market, are you willing to risk losing 50% to triple your money? Or are you under no circumstances willing to lose more than 10%, but you are guaranteed that more than likely you'll get a 50% return instead of a 300% return? So those are differing strategies. I mean, the thing to me that about Wall Street that I've always thought about the most is, and I don't remember who wrote it. He wrote, if you take 10,000 brokers on any given day, and you randomly say half say buy and half say sell, and the next day you find out whether the market went up or down, and then based on that you fire half that got it wrong. Remember, this is randomly assigned. There's no thought. And then that second day, you take that same group of remaining brokers and you randomly split them into half saying buy and half saying sell. And you keep doing that over the course of a month until you finally have the last guy standing who, by a random flip of the coin, got it right every day for the 30 days that you did it. He's going to be treated by everybody as the absolute guru, and whatever, sort of message he touts of how to pick stocks, everybody's going to take. But it was just pure probability that said one guy, if each day it's a 50% proposition and you split your population into two, at the end you're guaranteed to have one guy who got all of them right, who flipped heads 27 times in a row. And so how do you separate pure probability from an actual thinking person? And the way you do that is by examining how and what types of critical analysis they do, how they measure and risk, how they articulate risk versus return trades, and where your own personal preferences are on this risk versus return matrix in terms of what you're willing to accept or what you're shooting to achieve. And so I'm not telling anybody how to pick a stockbroker. I'm just saying that if you're not willing to do that kind of critical thought, if you are just willing to take sort of the randomness, then the randomness, and I think most books today will say, if you're not going to put a lot of thought into it, the best thing to do is buy an index fund and just let the market go, a low-cost index fund where you're not paying anybody to manage yourself, and just let the market take it where you will. But if you can invest in the right kind of critical thinking, and if you have access to the right kinds of information, which is the hard part, then you can actually beat the probabilities. You can do better than just splitting the broker population at 50% every day and find out who's standing at the end. So,
thank you for your time.
Oh, sure.